has integrity, but he knows his suffering, and he also accepts the principle that God is just, but he just can't reconcile why this is happening. And that was he kind of burnt out the backward and forth between Job and his friends, got really nowhere because they were, to some degree, they were both talking past each other. Although Job did contradict a number of their presumptions about God's justice. And we'll come back to that thought later on. Right, so let's go back to our lesson sheet. Hopefully you have one. They were emailed out and they're in the back, and they'd be perhaps given out this morning. So let's start with Elihu. What do we know about Elihu? What did you see in the scripture?
About personality?
Personal characteristics, yes.
He's young.
He's young, yes. He is young. And we'll have some more to say about that. What else?
He's deferred to the Job's friends, and so he's held his peace and not spoken in reference to the elderly.
Okay, so while he is young, he displays a degree of reverence for what you might call seniority of age. That's a principle that this culture that we live in today could well use somewhat as well. So that's positive. He listens and he waits. Anything else you notice? Yes.
He was upset with them because they found no answer yet to condemn Job.
Okay, so that's basically something we're going to look at in just a moment. That's kind of the motivation for him to speak. But in terms of his personal characteristics, there's something else that I think we could notice. It's found in chapter 32 and in chapter 33. If you read through those 5 chapters, you might have noticed some things said in chapter 33 as well that we could say something about his character.
He is confident in his opinion, and
Okay.
he's going to, he's been paying attention. He's listened well, and so he's going to quote
Yes.
Job and from the friends.
Yes, he is. So he's listened well, he is confident in his opinion. We'll talk about that as well. One other important characteristic.
He's willing to speak the truth even if it offends them.
All right. Well, that's a good point. I hadn't really considered that, but I think that's true. He, at least, even if he isn't necessarily correct, he's going to speak in alignment with what he believes is right, irrespective of the reactions.
I think he likes humility.
Okay. There is a sense of that, and sometimes connected to youth. Not necessarily the case, but yes, there are times when he lacks humility. On the other hand, as we've said, he's already deferential towards the older man. So I think it goes both ways. There's some aspect, but there's another ingredient that's important for us to notice. Yes.
Oh, he's full of words. He has a lot to say. I don't know if that's what you're looking for.
Well, no, let's go look at this. So let's just recap. He recognizes their age and he's deferential. He talks about being timid and afraid to declare his opinion. He is a Buzzite. Do you remember we talked in the very first lesson about some of this? Who is a Buzzite? Who was Buzz? Remember?
The descendant of Shem, one of Noah's sons, and he lived. I can't remember. Perhaps he was the son of Ram and Ram.
Well, he would have been a descendant of Shem by definition. He was actually a descendant of Nahor, Abraham's brother. He was his son.
Yes.
And so it really connects us back to this. He's a descendant. He's a Buzzite in the sense that by now Buzz and his clan have grown into a recognized clan. So it kind of implies several generations have passed since Buzz came onto the scene. So it fits with that. He waited, he listened. Something else here. 22. For I do not know how to flatter else my Maker would soon take me away. And then in chapter 33, my words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. What does that tell us about his personal characteristics?
I believe he has a great reverence for God. My first reading of the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. I took that as him claiming that he was speaking for God, and examining that some, looking at the Hebrew. Some would say, and I think probably is right, that he is just saying this is what, because God breathed the breath of life into mankind.
Yes.
And so we are capable of thinking and expressing our thoughts on this, and so that's the point, I believe.
I think you're right, and I think that fits with something he's going to say as well. He makes another reference. Who else is declaring the sincerity or the uprightness of his heart? Yeah, Job. Job's saying that, but Job, if you will, is not allowed to say that. I mean, he's not allowed to claim that innocence because he's suffering. Here is this other man, well, he can say it, and he's expecting to be believed as well. So the kind of double standards here among these ones who are talking with Job. All right, I think that's really pretty much what we can say about Elihu. There's not a lot we can say. So let's come back to why he's bursting to speak. There's this poetic language, he's kind of ready to burst. We've all experienced that sensation, I think, probably when we've been listening to a conversation and biting on time, and then we just can't. The other reason.
Job hasn't admitted his part in the situation.
Okay. So here he says it like this. He's angry with Job because he justified himself rather than God. And then he's angry at the friends because they found no answer. So let's look at that. The first one, he's justifying himself rather than God. There are probably two parts to that. What might the two parts to that be, do you think? Why would he be angry at Job for justifying himself, first of all?
I think you could interpret that Job is telling the good side of the story, right? That I'm telling how great I am. But then the justice side of God, that God has a long history and nature of condemning that which is wrong.
Okay. So there is a sense in which Job, because of his understanding of his innocence before God, his law-keeping, his integrity, is going to say some things that justify himself. And we're going to look at those. It's not necessarily that he is justifying himself alone. What is the other part of that?
Using God.
Himself rather than God. I think what we're seeing here is he's angry because there's a prioritization. He's spending his time mostly, and this is his perception. I'm not necessarily saying that Elihu was right in his perception, but his perception is that you've spent all this time basically saying why you're right, and you've, if you like, de-emphasized the righteousness of God. And he's kind of experiencing a righteous indignation, we might say, because of that. And, Job has repeatedly claimed integrity. We're going to look at what he says in just a moment, because I think there may be a little bit of revisionism going on here by Elihu. But that's part one, is the attitude of self-righteousness, the claim of integrity. But part two is that he's not putting God's righteousness as the most important thing he's defending. Elihu's very angry about that. And then he's angry with the friends because they found no answer. What's that finding no answer talking about?
They didn't find any sin in him. He wasn't, he had been a righteous man,
Okay.
his reputation.
Well, I think we could objectively say that they didn't have a basis to criticize him for sin, although they did criticize him for sin, in general terms and specifically as well. And we looked at some of those supposed sins that he had committed. I mean, we could go back to that if we had time. In chapter 22, you know, he was accused of basically, neglecting the needs of the poor and the oppressed and the fatherless, among other things. So they made some specific claims of sin against him, as well as the general ones. But what's the answer talking about? Let's start there. An answer to what?
Why this would be happening to Job?
Okay. Perhaps it could be there. Certainly that was part of it. Well, Job is presenting his side of the story, and what are they trying to do?
Disputed.
Yeah. They're basically trying to say of refuting his claims. They say some other things as well. So it's not that they didn't try to refute him. They did try, they just weren't successful. So I think the idea is you haven't been successful in your refuting of his claims. And basically the implication is, I'm going to come along and I'm going to do it. I'm going to be successful. I can do better than you can in this area. And he's deferred and he's waited and he's listened. So now he's going to basically tell them. So there's a degree of kind of arrogance about this, perhaps. Now, does Elihu show some empathy for Job as he gets started? What do you think?
It says, I'm the same as you.
Yes. That's really the essence of empathy. Sympathy is looking sort of more separately at someone's situation and having a degree of compassion and understanding and, in a sense, offering comfort and consolation for that situation, but somewhat from a distance. Empathy, though, is placing ourselves in the same situation, identifying personally with their situation. That's what he's doing. I am as you are. I too was pinched off. And going back to Mark's comment about what he said earlier on about this, he was made by the Almighty, the Spirit of God, and here he's been pinched off as a piece of clay. A lovely poetical description, and he potters among us. Yes, I know one potter among us who would identify with that thought. And then he says, behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy upon you. What's he talking about there? And how is that empathetic?
It stands as a contrast to what his friends have done. And he's saying that he's not going to do, I believe, what they've done. I don't know that he achieves that, but he is. That's not his intent.
Yes. He's not trying to pile on more to what Job is already suffering. He seems to accept in saying this that Job's already under a tremendous strain and suffering and affliction. So he's not going to. I think his point is, I don't want to add to that by creating fear of me. And again, I think there's some degree of humility that it's not him he should be worried about. if he's going to be fearful of anyone, it would be God himself. So there's a degree of empathy, but as Mark alludes to, I think, this empathetic tone fades pretty quickly, as we will see. It doesn't last very long. In fact, it's a similar pattern to what we saw with Eliphaz, when Eliphaz very first begins to speak to Job. He offers a few thoughts of comfort to Job, but that quickly fizzles out too. They don't have a lot of capacity at the end. All right, like you said, he would not answer the Job with the speeches of the friends. What did you think? Did he keep his word or not? Got a shake of the head. Yeah, I think there are some things that he added that were new ideas, if you like, new thoughts to add in, say, than he really did. I'm just going to point a few examples. So here he talks really about the idea of repentance to God and the subsequent restoration that God will grant, and the new kind of restored life that would result from that. And if he thinks that's something new that he's adding, we go back to Bildad here in the 8th chapter. You seek God and plead to the Almighty for mercy. If you're pure and upright, surely he will then rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation. Though your beginning and restore your latter days will be great. That's just one example of the same idea. It's not really a new idea. He says something like this as well. If you're righteous, what do you give to him? And what does he receive from your hand? This idea that your obedience, your innocence, your uprightness before God, what's it doing for God? Is his thought. Highly presumptuous kind of statement to make. Again, it's not new. Eliphaz said this: can a man be profitable for God? Surely he was wise and profitable himself. Is it any pleasure to the Almighty if you are in the right, or is it gain to him if you make your ways blameless? It's the same idea. So there's nothing new in these parts of his speech. So I don't think he really kept his word completely. There were some new things, and we will look at that. Let's think about how well he did to recap what Job said. This is really quite a challenge for us. Sometimes when we're in a discussion with someone, we don't have the same point of view. We aren't always as careful as we should be to represent what they've said to us. And we might home in on some things and twist some things and emphasize some things and really not do justice to where our kind of adversary, if you like, is coming from. So this is what Elihu had said. He highlights some things here. But particularly, I wanted to focus on this idea of there is no iniquity in me, I'm in the right. Do you think that is accurate?
No.
Okay. Why or why not?
He spoke of things that he had done, but he didn't speak of his sinlessness. Speaking back to Job. The things he had done, that God wanted him to do.
Okay, I'm not necessarily completely following that. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Probably not.
I think Job is saying, speaking generally in some instances, that I'm not, wickedness is not the course of my life. He's not claiming sinlessness.
Okay. I think that's right. He isn't claiming sinlessness. What I think has happened here is that Elihu has cherry-picked to some degree, because this is not what everything that Job said in the context of when he said it. And that's a lesson for us. We've got to be careful about cherry-picking people's words and making an argument from just part of what they had said. This is what Job had said when he had actually uttered the words, I am in the right. Elihu was right that he did say those words. But he said, though I am in the right, I cannot answer him. I must appeal for mercy. In other words, there's a sense that he might understand that he was in the right, but he's humble enough to recognize he is still in need of God's mercy. he talks about, let me know why you condemn me, or contend against me. Make me know my transgression. He believes he's in the right, but he doesn't eliminate the possibility that God has something against him that he's unaware of. He just wants to understand what that is. And I don't think Elihu has accurately or fully reflected what Job has said when he has made this statement, I am in the right. Again, I think a lesson for us from that. So, what new explanation does Elihu offer? He does actually add something to the discussion. And what did you see that he says with respect to God's silence? Remember, Job had felt abandoned by God. Why don't you answer me? I don't know where you are, God. I can't see you, I can't find you. That's his kind of perspective, Job's perspective. Elihu's offering an explanation.
He doesn't listen to evil men
Okay.
or
Yeah.
answer them.
Specifically, what kind of evil man?
Prideful.
Yes, pride. I think it's a really interesting observation. I believe it's an accurate observation. There's the idea of pride and this idea of an empty cry. The two could be connected. It could be that the empty cry is, if you like, the explanation for why the proud man is not going to be heard, because his cry is inevitably empty as the proud man. Or it could be something separate. It could be that it's a cry that's void of true humility, true faith in God, a right and upright heart. It could be that as well. But his point is, God is not going to listen to that. And we recognize that principle in our day and time as well under the New Covenant. And then he goes on, really basically, to say, look, Job, you are that proud man. Because he then says in verse 14, how much less when you say that you do not see him. He's making Job, in a sense, even worse than these proud men who have empty cries. It's now moved from this empathy to direct accusation. And so, we're seeing Elihu is maybe some of his righteous indignation, his youthful exuberance here coming out when he says this. Well,
And I think there's a good degree of pride in Elihu, in his own opinion here.
he'd actually already said in chapter 33 that Job was one who drinks up scoffing and travels with evildoers. So he'd already started to criticize Job and left behind his empathy. Okay, our next question. In what way is Elihu like Zophar? So what was Zophar like? Do you remember?
I put that he was speaking for God.
Okay, yes, he was. Incredible presumption. In what way here does he speak for God?
He believes that God hadn't punished Job enough.
Well, that's what Zophar's doing. That's right. God has not exacted of you. What your sins deserve is the gist of what Zophar says. But what does Elihu say?
I believe in verse 4, he is, when he says, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you, I think he's talking about himself.
Yes.
I don't think he's referring to the Lord.
Indeed. Because the context is, I will get my knowledge. So the immediate context is my knowledge. And one who's perfect in knowledge is with you. And he talked to I've heard something to say of God's behalf. I mean, just unbelievable arrogance and presumption that he would speak like this.
Jeremy,
Yes.
have you dealt with people that feel like they hear audibly from God, and when we try to share the Bible or the gospel or the truth with them, they have contradictory things to say? They're very set and prideful that God has told me this, and I believe these things. It's a special knowledge that I have from God,
Yes.
and you don't understand it. You know,
That's
so
right. I think you're right. I think that is the perspective of some people that we will talk to. So let's go back. There are also some other things that Elihu says, I think, that are perhaps new elements to the discussion. What does he talk about with regard to affliction? Why is there affliction in Elihu's? So,
He believed that God was chasing him, and it's because of defiance and following him.
okay. We've got, first of all, rebuke. Affliction is connected with rebuke. The pain of affliction is man's rebuke. And then there's the opening of the ears, there's instruction. The opening of the ears by adversity. Those aren't necessarily new ideas. Because Eliphaz had already talked about God's reproof and discipline, and Eliphaz had talked about the idea of being binding up and delivering from those troubles. But what Elihu does now is he's actually going to directly apply these principles to Job in a slightly different way. And he basically says this: who has prescribed for him his way, or who can say you have done wrong? He's talking here in a broader context to Job about Job's criticism of God. The idea that Job, in Elihu's opinion, has charged God with wrong. God, you have done wrong. And he basically saying, this affliction is an instruction, a rebuke, and say that God has done wrong. And I think we have to be fair about what Job has said. These are some things that Job said in different places. If I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? So I think what he's charging God with here is that God is just has removed himself, and he's just watching at a distance what's going on. He's not really engaged, and he's not really being harmed by anything that is being done. Is the point that Job is trying to make here. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with what Job is saying. I'm just saying that's what he's saying. It's a kind of implied criticism that God is just standing off and letting all this happen, and yet still willing to criticize mankind for this. In 9:22 he said, it's all one, therefore I say he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. There's a sense of exasperation. And remember, that's in the context of him saying, look, it isn't true that the wicked always suffer and the righteous always prosper. He talks about how both the blameless and the wicked, die in the same way, and various afflictions and distresses happen to them both. And that's when he says, it's all one, therefore I say he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. What's the implied charging of God with wrong in that statement?
God's the destroyer.
No, it's not right that God, you should do that. I mean, it's basically, he's charging God that is not a fair treatment. That's the implication of what he says. In 10:3, does it seem to you good to you, God, to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the designs of the wicked? What's his point there? what's he saying about God in that? It's not right, it's not fair, it's not just. So I think to be fair with our treatment of what Job says, we have to acknowledge that Job did say some things that may have sort of been by implication, maybe not quite as directly as God, you've done wrong, but the implication is, God, you have done wrong in these cases. And that's what Elihu is talking about. Who can say you have done wrong? So it's an interesting point that he's making. There is some truth to it. And I want to suggest this for us, that Elihu's main beef, we might say, with Job is not that he has sinned, and because he's sinned, he's suffering a calamity. It's really that because he suffered a calamity, he's now committing the sin of charging God with wrong. And that's a difference in his perspective versus that of the friends. It's not a difference in his overall worldview of retribution, but it's a difference in his assessment of what Job is guilty of. And in that very limited sense, I think he has some justification. And I think it's something that we all need to take to heart. If there's a calamity in our lives, there is going to be the risk that we commit sin by charging God with wrong in that situation. We might sit here now, comfortable, maybe not dealing with any of that, and imagine that we would never do that. But we could get into a situation where something so terrible has happened that we do err on this path of charging God with wrong, irrespective of why the calamity is happening.
I think the intensity is heightened in part because of who Job is. He's a public figure. And he's on the anvil here and being tested by God. And this is very hard to come to grips with the difficulty of pain in our lives. And so Elihu has a point, but he's not in Job's position.
That's right. We don't want to condemn Job for this. We understand and can sympathize and even empathize perhaps with how he's feeling in part. But we're just acknowledging that he probably has a point, that he has, albeit somewhat indirectly, charged God with wrong on a few occasions now. Okay, so as we wrap this up, what's the last question here? Elihu is extolling something, and what's his main point in extolling what he extols? What is he extolling, first of all? You would have had to have read these verses and kind of just pulled out of the main thoughts.
Thoughts I have is God is all powerful. He sends rain, thunder, food, lightning. We cannot comprehend his actions.
Yes.
He sends ice and frozen waters, riding clouds, basically whatever he wants.
Yeah. So Elihu is, as you say, he's extolling God's power. He's extolling God's providence. He's extolling the fact that he is beyond man's comprehension. And that's kind of expressed in various ways, these various natural phenomena happening on the earth that we still don't fully understand. We understand some of that now, but we don't understand by any means all of it. So what's the point? Why is he going through this quite lengthy poetical extolling of these things? How might it fit with what we've just been talking about? This critique of Job, which is probably fair.
Who can question God?
Who can say that you have done wrong when we don't understand how God works? We can go to another realm of this earthly existence, and we just haven't got a clue. And I think that's his main point. If we accept that principle, then we can't say, God, you have done wrong. And I think overall, there's some interesting things that we don't have the time to really focus on them, but he talks about, can anyone understand? And then he talks about the phenomenon and what they're accomplishing. He judges people by these phenomena. That's interesting. These earthly weather phenomenon judge people. He gives food. Well, we understand that bit. And he talks about other things here that we cannot comprehend. And then the final verse, 13, whether for correction, or for his land, or for love, which I think is the loving kindness of God, God's loyalty and faithfulness to man, and his goodness and graciousness to man. Those are three different reasons all these things can happen. In other words, for Elihu, it's more than a one-dimensional cause and effect. There could be three causes and one effect, basically, in Elihu's mind. And I think he's just allowing for the fact that we can't interpret what's going on in this retribution scheme to go from cause to effect directly. There could be several different causes, and indeed, in Job's case, there were. So that's an interesting point he's making. Now let's just finish up by just saying this, that there are probably two main reasons why people think there is no reference to Elihu at the end of this book. God calls out the friends specifically for not having done what is right, spoken of me what is right, and calls on Job to offer sacrifices on their behalf. But nothing is said about Elihu. And so the two main ways this has been interpreted is that Elihu doesn't accuse Job of some specific sins like the friends did, and also his ideas about God's righteousness, shall we say, are less inaccurate. They're still inaccurate, but they're less inaccurate than the friends, and that therefore in God's eyes they are not worthy of rebuke. Because God intervenes at this point, and there's nothing said. But the other side of it is that God sometimes uses silence to communicate to man. Sometimes it isn't in words or deeds. Sometimes it's silence. Let me give you an example. There was this silence when Saul went to inquire of God. This is sometime after Samuel had already told him that you are no longer the king, and God has rejected you, and he was going to go into battle against the Philistines, and he called upon God, and there was no answer. And we take it from that God is communicating his displeasure. Jesus going before his accusers, before his crucifixion, he gave no answer. We take it from that God's displeasure. So that's the other possibility, and I think it fits better with the context, because in the 38th chapter, the second verse, God intervenes and says, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" Now he's speaking to Job directly, but you can imagine that Elihu is standing off to one side. God is speaking to Job, but he's speaking to Job about Elihu, because Elihu has been the one, when God intervenes, who's been giving counsel. Job's just been listening. Job's just been receiving counsel. And Elihu is the one that talks about one who is with you now, perfect in knowledge. And I believe that really what happens at the beginning of chapter 38 when God intervenes is actually God's rebuke of Elihu. And he repeats it actually. You have darkened counsel by words without knowledge. And just to reinforce that point, when Job is rebuked, God does not rebuke him for any of the self-righteousness or pride that he is accused of by Elihu and the friends. He's rebuked for something else. But what he is he's recognized by God for speaking of God what is right. So it seems to me that, you know, what that again indicates that Elihu rather than Job is the one who is being condemned here for speaking words without knowledge. So we'll look now at the next class at what God has to say to Job. Thank you very much for your comments this morning.